The environment was supposed to dominate the 2019 election in Canada. However, long before the news of the Prime Minister in blackface broke, pollster Mario Canseco was saying he doubts climate will dominate. In fact, he says it is very difficult to say that one issue will resonate across the country. In Quebec and BC, yes, the environment is high on the agenda. In Alberta, resistance to climate policies tops the polls. Ontario, the Maritimes, and the Prairies all have different issues. Who do you see as your Prime Minister? This may be the polarizing question that will make people rally behind one leader or the other. The current Prime Minister has been battered and bruised by environmental decisions that are at odds with one another. On one hand, he wants to build a pipeline. On the other, he wants to stop the use of fossil fuels. He's twice been found to have acted outside of the ethics of the office he holds, and still he probably stands the best chance of calling Sussex Drive home for the next 4 years. The challenge for voters is they don't hate him the way they despise Stephen Harper, and they don't seem to love anyone else. We invited Mario Canseco to join us for a conversation that matters about the myriad issues in play for the federal election in Canada and why picking a winner is becoming harder and harder.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the following and viewers like you. Please become a patron at conversationsthatmatter.tv.
Mario Canseco, we're going into the election with a whole host of issues that almost seem to be all over the place. What's your polling telling you are the dominant issues to British Columbians and then maybe by extension Western Canadians as we head into this federal election?
The days of the campaign where you had a couple of issues that you could use anywhere you went are over. There's a lot of concern about environmental issues, particularly in Quebec. It's about jobs and the economy in Alberta. It's about housing in BC. So it's definitely all over the place as far as what the federal politicians will have to talk about if they want to get.
Is that a reflection of the fact that we don't have a collective consciousness anymore? You know, you used to tune into one or two, maybe three different news sources. Who does that any longer? I mean, we have specialized news feeds depending on what's of interest to us. And is that affecting the way that we're now looking at our political leaders and the campaign?
It definitely is, particularly when you look at the age demographic. Younger people are more likely to be interested in issues such as housing, the environment, economy and jobs not so much. If you're a member of Generation X, you're more likely to be looking at the jobs issue. If you're over 55, you're more likely to be looking at healthcare. So you're finding those sources about the stuff that you care about. And it's very difficult for the federal politicians to walk into a room and to talk to everybody because everybody has something different in mind.
So one issue that does seem to be top of mind for all political parties is the environment. How important is that showing up in your polling?
Well, it's at a situation right now where it's higher than it's been over the past couple of years. I think it reached a state back in 2007 where you had more Canadians concerned about the environment than anything else. More than healthcare, more than the economy and jobs, more than housing. And then we had the financial crisis back in 2008, and everything shifted. Everything was about jobs, economy. We fought a couple of elections on that. And now it's starting to climb the charts again, which is quite interesting because it's definitely something that is happening globally. We have all of these discussions in the US, to a lesser extent in some European countries. Canada is definitely bound to have some of those conversations in the next few weeks.
You mentioned the United States. The environment seems to be a great dividing line. Is it a dividing line in Canada as well?
Well, I think we see it to a lesser extent in Canada. There's roughly 1 in 5 Canadians who do not believe climate change has been caused by man. It's a significantly smaller number than what we see in the US, for instance, where you have a much more polarized electorate. You have Democrats, you have Republicans, you have a few independents. But here, it's mostly people who live in Alberta, people who vote for the Conservative Party, who are saying there's no need to do this. This is all a sham. It's not necessary for us to make any sacrifices. And they also point to the situation about if we do something as one of the smallest countries when it comes to our actual number of residents, what is going to happen if India doesn't act, if China doesn't act? Now, when we ask Canadians, it's a tiny minority that feels this way. Most of us believe that it's something that should be dealt with immediately.
When we take a look at the role the environment is playing, which parties are going to benefit the most from this?
Well, when we ask Canadians, they definitely look at the Liberal Party as the one that could be doing the most to help environmental causes. To a lesser extent, it's the Greens. And I think there's this idea that maybe this election will be close enough where the Greens could actually decide what is going to be happening. So you may have a lot of people who vote for the Green Party, maybe in the hopes of getting into 5 or 7 seats, play a role in the formation of the next government. But we definitely don't see the NDP climbing the charts. And that was quite shocking to me when I looked at it, because this is one of the policies that they have championed for so long. Mm-hmm. They have been talking about this for years. And we just don't see Canadians right now engage with the NDP at a level that would suggest that they would be the ones better positioned to deal with this. Conservatives a little bit lower, of course. Mm-hmm. But with the Green Party, you need to look into something that happens consistently during federal races. They start to climb the charts in the middle of the campaign, maybe get to 7 or 8%, 10%, maybe 11%, and then they start to drop back when the election becomes about choosing the next government.
Do we know why?
There's this element of the electorate that says, I hate everybody. I'm not happy with the Prime Minister. I don't like the Conservatives. I'm never voting for the NDP. There's the Greens. And you park your vote there as the election continues. But once it becomes a matter of this is going to be your next Prime Minister, people start to move back from the Greens to the major parties.
And are the Greens in some ways perceived as being a single-issue party?
I think they are in many ways.
Is that a problem for them?
It is a problem, and I think part of the situation is the fact that it's been very difficult to actually gauge the effect of the Green Party in other jurisdictions. We had it here in BC. We have it right now with the government that is essentially supported by the Greens. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it in some other jurisdictions, but it's very difficult to assess what is going to happen with the Greens actually holding a lot of seats at the federal level. And I think this is one of the issues that is making the Greens in a way, be this sort of protest party. You know, I'm really upset with everybody, so I'm going to go Green. Elizabeth May has the highest ratings of everybody, partly because she's been there the longest. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you like her and you're going to vote for the party. Jack Layton had a similar scenario back in 2006. Everybody said that he was the most liked leader, but they didn't get the votes for it until 2011.
So you talk about the NDP adhering to an environmental agenda for quite some time now, and they're not picking up any traction there. And then we see what happened in New Brunswick, and it has created quite a rift between the NDP and the Greens. Who's going to be impacted by that?
Well, it's a tough one to call right now because it's not an area where the NDP or the Greens do well.
Period, anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, they're fighting over a space of land where they're probably not going to get any seats, regardless of what happens in the next few weeks.
But it doesn't look it doesn't look good on either party, does it?
No, I think it's definitely not the kind of situation that you want to build upon. If you're the Greens and saying, you know, come right up, if you're not happy with the leader that the NDP has, you try to do it in a much more nuanced way. Mm-hmm. But it's also very difficult for the NDP because they had to know that after Jack Meeting became leader, they were going to face this question.
So I got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is brought to you by Odlum Brown, a client-focused investment firm that starts client relationships with straightforward conversations focused on you, your aspirations, and your investment priorities. Odlum Brown has been a supporter of Conversations That Matter from the day we started this show. Their only condition was that we provide a non-biased conversation with people from all sides of all sorts of issues. And of course, we couldn't produce this show without the support of Oh Boy Productions. If you're looking to produce a show like this one, I suggest you reach out to Oh Boy. They can help you produce it, and they can help you build your audience. And we also need your support. I ask you to please pledge $1 per show by going to conversationsthatmatter.tv/donate, because those dollars add up and play an important role in helping us produce this show. Now, back to the show. Jagmeet Singh, you know, I look at him and he's clearly an intelligent man. He's a crafty politician like anybody who, you don't wind up being the leader of a major Canadian political party if you don't have some political savvy. But, you know, I remember reading Bill Clinton's book, My Life, and in it he talked about the role of the leader as being the image and likeness of the voters' perception of their president or governor or prime minister. And I think that this is the problem for Jagmeet Singh, is that he does not present in the mind's eye of a broad swath of Canadians as being the person that they're going to rally behind. And I find myself being very careful about the way that I say that, because I'm not trying to say, because he's not Caucasian, that therefore he's not a Canadian. That's not the case. It's just that, we are visually driven, and we look at a leader and say, is that an accurate representation of me? And I think that this is the big challenge.
It is, especially in a campaign that is more about image than anything else.
Yeah.
This is the way campaigns are going now. And, we may point out to specific platforms and things that you want to do, but it becomes a matter of image, especially when you're exchanging sound bites over the internet or WhatsApp messages. That is what is going to stick with you. And they have a very big problem in Quebec, because Quebec, they did very well back in 2011 with Jack Layton, who was essentially the only Quebecer who was running to become prime minister in that race. They benefit from many voters that would have gone to the Liberals and decided not to under Michael Ignatieff. They keep some of those seats under Tom Mulcair, another Quebecer, and now they head into an election without a Quebecer as leader. So there's going to be a very difficult task for the NDP to try to hold on to those votes in Quebec, which is the best area that they have right now.
Quebec, that eastern part of the country, also has the Bloc, and it also has Maxime Bernier. So what do you see happening in that part of the country and its ability to deliver for the Liberals, the number of seats that they need if they hope to form another majority government?
Well, for the Bloc, I think we go back to the last election provincially. And I was looking at my own numbers before the election and looking at the Parti Québécois below the Mendoza line, as we say, like at 19%. It's like, really, this is going to happen? And it ended up happening. There's a lot of changes, especially younger Quebecers don't really care that much about sovereignty. You have to tell them that actually Charles de Gaulle said what he said back in 1967.
Do they even know who René Lévesque was?
Probably only because it's the name of a big street. It's very difficult for that younger Quebecer to look into the issue and say, this is the problem. The problem is that we are not part of a distinct society. So what you have now is a bunch of people over 55 who continue to vote for the sovereignist parties, but they're not really replacing them with Generation Xers or millennials who are tired of this debate.
So Maxime Bernier, of course, is standing on his head around immigration and seems to be trying to stay on point, but he quickly gets shouted down. He seems to be saying, I'm not against immigration, I'm against illegal immigration. And probably everybody in Canada is against illegal immigration. But when you make it a platform issue, it's very touchy.
Well, it's almost like he's running to become governor of Texas. He's using sound bites that aren't applicable for Canada. And I think that's part of the problem. There's a fear from the Conservatives that a rise for the People's Party could lead to them losing a lot of seats. And that was a danger 6 or 7 months ago. The campaign hasn't gained a lot of traction. We still see him with the lowest approval rating of all federal leaders. He's not going to participate in many debates, so that also takes away some of that opportunity for Canadians to get to know him. And it's essentially a campaign that is geared towards a very libertarian group of people who this appeals to, but it's a minority. It's not a situation that is going to propel him to become the third or fourth party.
When I first saw him starting to emerge on the national scene, independent now of the Conservative Party, I started to wonder whether or not we were going to start to see this move towards populism that had swept through the United States, the UK. We saw the election of Doug Ford, and of course in Alberta we saw the swing as well. Alberta, I'm not entirely sure, is a reflection of a populist movement, rather a return to what was the norm. But I started wondering, okay, is populism in the American form starting to find its way into Canadian politics? I'm not sure that it is showing up outside of Ontario. What are you finding?
Well, I think it definitely has to do with taking over specific political organizations that exist. You look at the UCP, for instance. None of this would have happened if there's no cohesion, if there's no merger between the old Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party. Similar situation in Ontario. If Doug Ford hadn't been the leader, it would have been a very difficult situation for them to win that election.
Right.
And to talk about populism. So, and you look at the situation in the States with Donald Trump. He didn't say we're going to create a Trump party, even though he probably would have loved to have his name like that.
Well, there's some people who suggest that he has now. The Republicans have acquiesced to Donald Trump.
But it's because he definitely takes over. And we went through that process of a lot of Republicans who were scared of the situation and then ended up voting for him because they didn't want Hillary Clinton to be president. Now, is that going to be happening again in a couple of years after everything that we've been through? That's a tough one, especially when you look at the election. It's 3 states. It's about 70,000 votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. 70,000 votes decided the presidency because of the Electoral College. And I think whoever is the Democratic nominee, they're going to be pounding the doors hard in those 3 states because they know that's the ticket to winning.
True. We don't have that same situation here.
No.
But we definitely have fragmented regions because so if we talk about what's happening in Alberta, well, you take a look at what's happening in British Columbia, we're moving much more to a far more progressive perspective, which bodes well for the current provincial government. But how's that going to have an impact on the federal scene, especially considering the Liberals picked up, quite a number of seats here when Justin Trudeau ran in the last election?
That was quite an election. I mean, you look back at the election of 2011 under Michael Ignatieff, and in British Columbia, the Liberals only get 13% of the vote. That's negligible at best. With Justin Trudeau, they get 35%. They're the number one party, most seats. They get seats in places they didn't expect it, like Mission, for instance. So they come back as an urban party. But it's much more difficult to campaign 4 years later with your record. And we also need to remember that there was a very concerted effort to get strategic voters out there. There were essentially people knocking on doors and saying, we know you're an NDPer at heart, and we know you want to vote for the Greens maybe, but in this election, we really need you to vote Liberal because the goal here is to get rid of Stephen Harper. You don't have that anymore. And
you don't have that polarizing figure to get people to rally behind. Yes.
Right. So in that sense, look at it from the standpoint of a younger voter who was probably enthralled by the promise of electoral reform, the last first-past-the-post election, not having a pipeline going through Burnaby. And then what happens? 4 years later, are you going to go back to the Liberals, or are you going to go to the NDP or the Greens, or maybe not show up?
Well, okay, so what role will the SNC-Lavalin affair play? Its connection to the Huawei apprehension in Vancouver, and how all of this has affected our relations, in particular with China. I know it's a mishmash, but they're all connected.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, part of the problem is you look at the Huawei thing, there's not a lot of discussions about the government mishandling this. When we ask Canadians, they tell us point blank, this was handled properly. If there's a situation where you need to detain somebody because a country needs them, you have to follow the rule of law. That's definitely there.
Okay, that's a good point.
That's a good point.
Except for when you don't follow the rule of law.
Well, of course. But Huawei, the level of animosity towards allowing Huawei to participate in the development of the 5G network in Canada is highest in BC.
Yes.
And that definitely tells you something about the apprehension that many British Columbians have about the way the Chinese government has been behaving.
Yes.
So that's an issue that's there. Now,
so we've done an interesting interview that's coming up in a couple of weeks after you with Jonathan Manthorpe and his incredible book, Claws of the Panda, that discusses in great detail exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, it's a very difficult scenario because what we see here is when it comes to the foreign policy, and there's not a lot of people who vote based on foreign policy, but there's an advantage to the incumbent always. And, you ask people, who do you want dealing with Donald Trump? 2-1 margin, they say Justin Trudeau. He's done that before. Now, has he handled everything perfectly? It's very tough to tell, particularly when it comes to this issue. And when you look at the SNC-Lavalin issue, it's not easy for him to go out there and say, we did what we had to do. In a province like this one, Jody Wilson-Raybould is very well known. I think it's going to be a very tight race competitively in the next few weeks. And she's somebody who's admired because of everything that the Liberals said it meant. I think that's part of the problem here. Here we have Aboriginal woman, first Justice Minister. You build this up in a way that when it breaks, it's
clearly,
impossible to put it together.
Yeah, and she pretends to adhere to the law and did.
And did.
And so then that has an impact on the Indigenous vote, which was also important to the Liberals in 2015.
Incredibly important, that and the youth vote. And it's ultimately about a campaign that was based on the idea of hope. And you saw the ads with Justin Trudeau, very different from the ads that we saw from the NDP or the Conservatives at the start of the campaign. Is it going to be the same way this time around? Or are they going to have to come out and attack Andrew Scheer, deal with Jagmeet Singh in a way that doesn't siphon some of those progressive voters? It's difficult because there's a lot of attention to this particular race. And
Right.
the coverage of the debates, for instance, in Vancouver-Granville, is going to reach the national stage. And that brings back the SNC-Lavalin issue
Right.
to the forefront and makes voters think twice.
So the Prime Minister is vulnerable, but the most viable alternative appears to be Andrew Scheer, and yet he's not getting traction.
Not as a leader. I think that's been part of the situation here. There's always that fluctuation between liberals, conservatives. Here in BC, I think there's a few ridings that are definitely at play, particularly in the North Shore, North Vancouver, West Vancouver. Those are ridings where the Conservatives could do very well. But we haven't seen a process of falling in love with Andrew Scheer, so to speak. It has been very slow. We still see about 1 in 4 Canadians who don't know who he is. And I think part of it is that he spends so much time as the speaker. You know, you're not part of any of those discussions. You're not as well known as somebody like James Moore, for instance, or Jason Kenney, who were there at the forefront.
Right.
You're essentially the guy who says the yeas have it, the nays have it, and that's it.
Right.
So you haven't built that specific profile. They're definitely trying very hard. Family man, talking about specific boutique tax cuts. That worked very well for Stephen Harper when he formed his first government. I think they're going to follow something similar to that.
Okay, so we're just about out of time here. I'm going to ask you as best you can, because I think this is probably one of the most fragmented elections there is. What do you think the outcome is going to be?
Well, I think it depends on a couple of factors. I look at the national numbers, and they tend to be overinflated because of the way Alberta's voting. We
Yes.
have 60, 70% of people saying I'm voting Conservative. That inflates the numbers, but it's not going to mean that the election will be as close as it is when it comes to seats.
Right.
It's ultimately where Quebec goes. If the NDP vote collapses and goes to the Liberals, they may have enough to reach the West Coast and try to hold on to as many seats as they can in BC and form the next government. But it's ultimately about how you connect. Debates play a role, not necessarily having that knockout punch like John Turner had in 1984,
Right.
but ultimately the analysis of the debates and what happens later. I remember back in 2011, Jack Layton had a great debate, and by the weekend we had the NDP in second place, and everybody
Yes.
freaked out around the office. But ultimately that is what happened.
Yeah. So it's too hard to tell right at this point, isn't it?
It's too early too. I think one of the things that I've learned over the course of my career is ask the day before because everything
Or maybe
changes.
the day after.
Well, that too.
Because, I just think about the Christy Clark surprise victory, on the night of the election. People are going, what? So no matter how much polling we do, it allows us to focus on the issues, but until people actually go into the voting booth and mark down their ballot, we don't know for sure, do we?
Well, I had an email the next day after that particular election from a lady in Carriesdale who said, "Dear Mario, I took your survey. I told you I was going to vote for the NDP. When I got to the polling station, I couldn't do it. I voted Liberal, and I'm sorry for any pain this may have cost you." And that was one of the most beautiful emails that I've received.
But that makes it hard in the job that you're in to be able to come with accuracy now. And I think it's far more difficult than it was 15 or 20 years ago to do that polling and say, this is what we predict will be the outcome.
Well, especially when we're as fragmented. It's
Yeah.
not that U.S. elections are easy, because they're not. But when you have 5 different parties, when you have people looking at all over the place and having second choices and trying to figure out if they're voting for the leader or the candidate in the riding, makes it even more complex. But ultimately, it's about waiting until the last moment to figure out how the people will vote.
Well, it's going to be exciting. Thanks for coming in and sharing this with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah.